So, another series of podcasts, this time about supporting learning resources. In this first article, I want to talk about the experience I recently had that prompted me to think about this all over again. I think we're already well on the way to making interesting progress on the topic. At least this is what I often see when visiting universities and colleges. However, I also see some, how should we say, legacy systems, and with these, a lot of inertia that may be holding up our progress. So I want to talk about libraries. I was visiting a large university recently, and I was taken on a tour of its library, massive library. This is a multi-floor monster with literally millions of books. It remains a very traditional space, the kind of library that I recall from my own undergraduate education in the 1970s, a place mainly of silence. And two things struck me immediately. First, as some colleagues were looking at books in their own subject areas, I took a look at the collection in my own. Astonished, I quickly came to an estimation that one could pulp, not archive, maybe 60 to 70% of the books, and one could archive perhaps another 20 to 30%. In other words, without any current intellectual loss, one could remove at least 4 out of 5 of the books from the shelves. We're really good at buying books, but we're much less good at what is often called a policy of weeding, getting rid of out-of-date materials. Second, I spent a little time on an entire floor that was dedicated to periodicals. I looked down a double-lined alley of shelves, tens of meters long, with materials as old as the 1960s and no more recent than the late 1980s. As I reeled from that, I suddenly realized that the situation was even more peculiar. These were not even periodicals, they were abstracts of periodicals. Each book contained several hundred pages of abstracts of papers, not the papers themselves. These shelves contain brief summaries of literally millions of academic papers. 99.9%, maybe even fewer of them, completely worthless in today's world. It's almost certain that none of the volumes between 1960 and 1980 have ever been consulted seriously. Let me take these two observations in turn. Why don't we weed our libraries? I think simply seeing books on shelves, no matter how worthless, gives us a sense of security. A false one, of course. If we got rid of the books that are of no current value, then we'd see empty shelves and feel very unsettled. Of course, the proportion of books that need to be removed depends an awful lot on the subject area. It's more likely that in computer science one would need to weed more systematically and more frequently, more ruthlessly, than say in a subject like history. But finding sensible ways of storing and presenting materials of use is a topic we should be thinking about. With modern technology, materials can at the very least be readily indexed and possibly even fully scanned and accessible electronically. Most students these days, particularly in STEM subjects, only ever make use of ebooks anyway, and they don't make use of them inside a library. Second, what's the point of keeping all those indices of publications, or even the ancient publications themselves, at least in a good number of subject areas? Well, the library I visited is both a resource for the current students and faculty, but it's also a national resource. So there is probably a good reason to keep this material in some form for the second of these reasons. But on the shelves, this floor of the library was like some kind of intellectual graveyard, a cemetery of gravestones marking an earlier time. And like a graveyard, there is a good reason to keep an account of our past, people and their intellectual efforts. But in the case of a modern library, we surely do not need to be taking up masses of real estate. The vast majority of this needs to be properly indexed and the hard copies consigned to an archive where a scholar who really needs the material to consult could do so within a couple of working days. So, as I walked around the library, I began to imagine what an amazing space it could be for learning, how release space could be re-engineered as a learning environment with access to useful learning resources. Would we build a traditional library anymore? In some parts of the world, we apparently still do. Small institutions that don't have an archival responsibility are often doing away with the silent book-lined aisles in favour of something else entirely. It's perhaps harder for established libraries to reimagine themselves and somewhat easier for new initiatives to jump into a more appropriate future. So, what are the options for learning spaces and learning resources now? This and related questions we'll look at in the future.